Hello, good evening, and welcome to SCOTONOMICS episode 97. Hello, Kieran. Good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I've just been to the city of Cork for a few days, and that is a fantastic, thriving city. I really enjoyed. I'd really recommend it to people to visit.
Yeah, fantastic place. I love that bit of the world. And we're also joined for our discussion on the wellbeing economy by one of our favourite guests, Dr Lukas Bunse. How are you doing, Lucas?
Hello, yeah, I'm doing well. Enjoying the longer days.
Yeah, it's much nicer now, isn't it, with the brighter and the longer days. Well, that introduces us beautifully to the idea of a wellbeing economy, Lucas, which isn't just all about you earning and spending your money, but actually enjoying what nature and what life has given you. So just a little short introduction for our audience. We often cover the wellbeing economy, but we thought it was a really good idea to have a little bit of an update, look at the what the We All Alliance has been doing, what's happening in Scotland, maybe a wider perspective of the wellbeing economy as well. Please do put your questions into the chat, and we'll try and get to them as quick as we can. We're going to do a very brief introduction, introduce people to the wellbeing economy, the work of the We All Alliance, and then we'll get into some harder questions for you, Lucas, once we give you that easy introduction. So thanks for joining us. Do you want to give us a little bit of background about yourself and who the We All Alliance are?
Yeah, very happy to do that. So my background is more in kind of research and academia. So I studied sustainable development and ecological economics in uni, and then did a kind of PhD in wellbeing economy. And in that time, I got to know We All a bit, or the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. For short, we tend to call it We All. And after I finished my research, I was basically like, I wanted to do a bit more work on kind of the policy coalface, so to speak, in terms of implementing some of the ideas. And that's where, that job at We All in Scotland came up, and which I've been really enjoyed for the last couple of years. So We All really is, in a nutshell, is a collaboration of organizations and individuals who want to work together to redesign our economy into a wellbeing economy, which prioritizes people and planet. And it's really kind of brought together by people with a shared understanding that a lot of the problems we're facing, whether it's poverty or climate change or biodiversity loss or other things, in many cases are actually linked through the way we have set up our economy. So the way we've designed our economy is really at the root cause of these problems. And if we redesign our economy, we can address some of them. And it's a global alliance. It's open for anyone to join who kind of shares the same values and the same ideas. And there are different kind of regional hubs as well. So Scotland is one of the more developed hubs, and that's the organization I work for, which is We All Scotland. And that's partially because some of the founders of We used to live in Scotland, like Catherine Trebek is maybe one of the more famous people, although unfortunately she moved back to Australia, so we haven't got her around anymore.
Yeah, she's always just a Zoom call away, isn't she, Lucas? Do you want to give us an idea of the work to date that the We All Alliance has done? Let's kind of focus specifically on Scotland.
Yeah, so kind of the core idea behind We All is really in the name. It's an alliance, so it's actually wasn't developed to really do a lot of new stuff, but it was there to bring together all the alternative economic work and visions that were already out there, whether that's things like community wealth building or donut economics or social enterprises or the cooperative movement. Like there's so many people who are doing really interesting stuff in that area already, but we felt that wasn't connected well enough. And the idea is really to kind of build links, make sure there's enough diversity to spark interesting work, but also enough coherence to kind of build a movement that can actually kind of advocate and work for these kind of more structural challenges. And that's kind of where the heart of what We All does, is trying to build that movement. So we have, as I said, you can join as a member if you're interested. And then a part of that work is around changing the narrative around the economy. So what is the economy for? Who is the economy for? How can we embed a different purpose at the economy that is really about providing the kind of things that everybody needs and making sure that we stay within the environmental limits of our planet. And then also specifically, and so in that sense, we've done some work on like, we do like regular Wellbeing Economy 101 webinars. So if for any of you, this is the content here today is not enough. There's a little bit more depth there. There's resources on the website, but we've also been doing a few, like a little animation, for example, on our social media on these kind of ideas, and trying to engage with the media and stuff. But then we also do quite a lot of policy work in Scotland as well, because we actually have a government which is on some level signed up to the idea of a wellbeing economy, compared to, which is quite unique. That means we try to work with the government or push it in the right direction to actually do some kind of concrete stuff as well.
Fantastic. And we'd definitely like to hear about that in detail. I mean, I think one of the most useful things you've done today is to really draw all the people who are, supportive of the idea of a wellbeing economy together. But not everyone agrees what a wellbeing economy is and how we get there and how quickly we move to that. And your definition, a wellbeing economy, is an economy designed to serve people and the planet, not the other way around, I think has been really useful, because I don't know anyone who's in the wellbeing space who would disagree with that as an overall concept. Is that the feedback you get, or do you still get people who are saying we're not too sure if that's the overall description that we would give a wellbeing economy? And again, the description as a wellbeing economy is an economy designed to serve people and planet, not the other way around.
Yeah, and as I said, we haven't got like the one line. So another one we like to say, if we take short, is like, we're designed to deliver good lives for all on a healthy planet. Is another one of our favorites. We still get a bit of, I think the thing is that the reason WEAll has really grown over the last few years is because that concept has actually resonated with a lot of people. And that meant that actually the wellbeing economy has become a bit more now than just to bring together things, because people are interested in the fact, so what actually is a wellbeing economy? And we want more than just high level concepts. But on that high level, it's generally the things everybody agrees with. And we have like 5 kind of key, we call them WEAll needs, which are the kind of priorities we think every economy should deliver. And that is, what the first one is dignity, so everyone has enough for a happy life. The second one is nature, so we have a restored natural world. Third one is fairness, so income, wealth, and power is distributed fairly. The fourth one is purpose, like our institutions serve the common good, and the kind of things that are serving social and environmental well-being are also rewarded. And then the last one is participation, which is really the idea that people have a say in the decisions that affect them, whether it's in their countries or in their workplaces or in their communities. And that's kind of things which we developed with our members a while ago, but they generally tend to resonate very well. There's very few people who disagree with these. And they also kind of echo some of the things that have been found in the academic literature on like universal human needs, and also even in religious texts and indigenous teaching. So yeah, so then there are, in terms of how we get there, that's a different question. So there's a bit more disagreement, maybe not even so much in the movement, but also in terms of the government and a few other players. But I think overall, I think one of the reasons that the concept has really taken off, it's now talked about not just in Scotland, it's talked about in the EU more and more, it's talked about in other countries. It's because people really feel like, yeah, that's a good idea, like we're really lacking some of this.
Yeah, shall I come? I've got quite a lot of questions for Lukas, so I've got 6 questions actually, so please do interrupt me, William, when you need to. I guess I want to get into the gubbins of this really as a local councillor, and also I think some of the things in your WEAll response to the Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill be really great questions for SNP members to be asking their MSPs at their branch meetings as well. So, for example, you talk about overarching structure for decision making and accountability, but you also mention within that first paragraph that there are some elements of such a structure already existing. Could you maybe give us some examples of what those elements that already exist are and what you think can be improved upon them? Yeah,
so maybe as a little bit of background. So the government has just promised in its manifesto before the election, in its program for government, to produce a Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill. And the idea behind that is really to kind of streamline the decision making in Scotland to around wellbeing and sustainable development, that really that becomes like the key goal that drive decision making for the government and other public bodies. And it's a bit similar to the Future Generations Act in Wales, which they passed in 2015. And that is very much building on some of the things we already have. And the key there is, I think, the national outcomes. So I don't know how many people are aware of that if you're listening, but Scotland has a national performance framework, which sets out 11 national outcomes, which, the government agrees is the kind of describe the kind of Scotland we want to see. So that's around like reducing poverty. It's around very similar to the 5 needs that I outlined, but there's 11 of them. And that's a really good thing. And Scotland was really a pioneer with establishing that. And they're aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals as well, but they were actually around before that already.
Maybe you could give me some examples of how they could improve upon what's there.
Yeah,
so that's a really obvious example of a structure that already exists.
Yeah.
What do you think that they need to do? Or, I imagine there's quite a few things. So maybe give a few examples of things that you think they need to do in order to improve upon that.
Yeah, so the problem with them at the moment is that they're not really being used. A lot of people don't really know about them. And so what a core part of the bill is basically to try and strengthen that. And I think one of the biggest focus area for us is related to that participation element, which I mentioned, is that the government has to review these outcomes every 5 years. They've just done a review, but that's not really done with a proper democratic and consultative process. If you consider how important these goals are, I think you really need something more substantial, like, for example, a citizens' assembly with some extra work that really goes to reach out to these, kind of seldom heard voices of people who are usually not really considered in that policy making. So that's kind of in how they are developed, but then also in how they're used at the moment. They're very much mostly used as kind of, tick box exercise after the fact. They decide what they want to do and then they justify it afterwards by ticking some boxes on the national outcomes. Whereas we want to switch that around so that really they become the starting point for thinking. And that would probably involve kind of stronger legal duties on public bodies to do that. At the moment, they just have to have regard to the national outcomes. You can formulate that more strongly. But I think more important is actually support. We need like different ways of thinking, different ways of working, toolkits and stuff like that to really show people this is how you actually use them. And hopefully that would be part of what comes forward in the bill as well around, for example, another key part could be a Future Generations Commissioner, similar to what they have in Wales, who could then do this kind of supporting work, but also do a bit of accountability and scrutiny whether, the government actually is doing well in achieving these outcomes that they've set themselves.
So that was question 3 for me. I wanted to know about this Future Generations Commissioner and who would have this helicopter view. What's your vision there? Is this an office? Are we talking about one person? It would be a top researcher into this? They would be going around the country and speaking to councils, for example, who are expected to bring in this into their work practices as well. So for us, when our officers present reports to us, they have lots of caveats at the end about how they've gone about, the methodology of the reports, and how they've tried to include things like, sustainable development. So your Future Generations Commissioner, how do you envisage that as a role? And is it an office? Is it going to require, a lot of investment? That's my big question, really.
Yeah, so I think we envisage that very similar actually to what you described. So it is an office, but probably have a kind of head person as Future Generations Commissioner, because we think that a lot of the value in the commissioner is actually in that public role and having that public face to really be a champion for future generations, but actually be much wider in terms of, as we said, like help people implement a different way of working that works towards sustainability. Also, we could think about doing some kind of quite novel ways of bring that participatory element in there as well, which is not as strong in Wales. Like maybe we could have a commissioner with an office, but also a kind of, I don't know, like citizens council supporting it, for example. It's probably worth saying that at the moment it's not clear. There are different options for how far that could go. You could take it even further and give it like legal powers on scrutiny, so that they would have to investigate laws that the government wants to bring in, and then say like, yes, these are in line with, you know, the well-being of future generations or not. And then the government would have to review them. That's a very strong option. I think in terms of, I think it would require some investment, but I think it would be worth it, because there is a lot of concern around for people like, oh, we've got another commissioner and we have to spend even more money on this. But if the government is serious about this bill and actually about the streamlining, then that will require some investment and some resources to actually help people do it. And that has to come in one way or another.
Yeah, so
And
you're really looking at someone who's really knowledgeable about this, and that they can help. It would be councils and government as well to implement this, you know, at the officer level. It's also important that you mention later on that this is not onerous, you know, that it doesn't become another set of things that the officers, both in the government and in local government as well, don't have to, you know, try and learn a whole load of new things as well, because, you know, clearly we're very currency constrained in Scotland. And that brings me to my second question is,
I just want to make a point, Karen, before we actually had the Future Generations Commissioner from Wales speak at the SCOTONOMICS conference, our Festival of Economics. And it was a wonderful opportunity for organisations in Scotland to come and hear from him and engage and question. But unfortunately, there's very few of the third sector represented at the Festival of Economics. And it was a real shame that we're bringing these, you know, these experts to Scotland. We're not getting the broad support of the third sector and the progressive organisations in Scotland. So I just want to highlight, Lucas, there's lots of things like this going on, but there's not a lot of engagement. So it was a real shame that we didn't have that interaction, because he came to Scotland, didn't meet with anyone, didn't get any of his learning or experience, and he went back down again. So a real shame. So I think if someone, you know, you're all about organising and coordinating, it would be good to make the most of the, you know, the events and the things that we are doing. That's also for our audience to say that we've actually got the panel session that the future Commissioner for Wales on our Patreon site for people who attended the conference. So that content is there, and obviously, Lucas, I'll open that up to you if you want to have a look at it, because it was a really interesting interview that Leslie Riddick did with him, and also when he appeared on the panel. Sorry to cut in, I'll disappear and you can get back to that other question.
No, I should probably add to that, actually, that, you know, the lady who interviewed them is very, very keen on, you know, much more democracy. You know, we actually don't have that many elected representatives per capita in comparison to our neighbours across the North Sea. And, you know, he was talking about, it sounded like he had a lot of quangos working underneath him. And, you know, I am certainly very keen on real democratic participation, you know, that you put yourself up and people vote for you, and then you get the job, you know. So I think that's quite an important thing as well. But my second question was on can Scotland become a world leader in sustainable development? And that really happen when we're not monetarily sovereign. This is my concern, because a lot of what you're talking about in your response really requires A, more time for scrutiny, and B, more money. And we're so currency constrained in Scotland, as you know.
Yeah, I think there's something to it, in the sense that I think the Scottish government it's actually, on some level, I think a lot of that stuff is actually not so much about new money in the bill. So that is about actually doing things differently with the money that we already have. And I think there's quite a potential there.
Okay.
But
so can you elaborate on that, for example?
Yeah, so as I said, this bill is about kind of making decisions differently, in a sense, if that makes sense. So it's about how do you work together better across silos and across different. It's about how do you actually set different priorities from, you know, compared to what we do at the moment, like where you can and what are the kind of ways you can it's not easy because you have 11 outcomes and you sit there as like an official and you're like, okay, what do I do now? Which one should I prioritize? What are the trade-offs between them? So this is kind of, like background work that needs to happen.
So have you examined the democratic processes at the moment and what they are and where they're lacking? So for example, communications between councillors, MSPs, MPs, is that working optimally? Because you're talking about not actually having more money for this, it's really about a change of working practices. So have you really looked at those working practices and worked out ways that could go better? So you reduce the siloization.
Yes, so there's in a certain way, there's like, for example, in Wales in the Act, they had like a certain number of ways of working in the Act, and I don't know exactly what it is, but one is like to be participatory, one is like to be long-term thinking and preventative, and in a lot of ways these kind of things are kind of quite well known. Like the Christie Commission was like 2011 or something, which had figured out some of these things were not going very well. But actually doing that in practice is quite hard. And I have to say, we haven't worked out all the details for that, which is why, for example, we would like to see a Future Generations Commissioner who then has the time and hopefully the resource to work some of these kind of things out. But coming back to your question before, I think this is what the bill is about. And it's about doing better decisions in whatever kind of framework you have, and to use the investment and the money that you have. But I do think to actually get to some true well-being economy and some true sustainability in terms of what we have to do on climate change, is what we have to do on poverty and other issues, that probably requires investment, which the Scottish government hasn't got the money to do at the moment. So, but that's a slightly different question for me from, the bill is what you do with whatever you have. And that's a question of what are the kind of things that you do have access to.
Kieran, I've got a question from the audience here. Lucas, could you explain the economic links to the 5 aims? I think, Hashbury, I'll just tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think you're kind of saying a little bit kind of watery, doesn't really explain much in terms of the economy. Do you want to just kind of explain how that kind of manifests itself within the economy? And Hashbury, tell me if I got that completely wrong, but I hope that's where you were coming from.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think there's kind of 2 parts to that. So the first part is that actually I think part of the reason that we talk about the well-being economy is in that way, because we actually want to widen the idea of what is the economy. Like at the moment, when we talk about the economy, we often mean private sector businesses. But in reality, there's a lot more in terms of if we look at how we organize ourselves to meet the needs that we have, a lot of that comes from, unpaid care work mostly done by women. It comes from things like, government-run hospitals. And I think it's really important that we see the economy in that wider view, if we want to make sure that, we can set it up in a way that does all these things. But so that's the kind of first aspect of it, why we have it quite wide. But I think in the other hand, all of these have specific links to the more traditional way where we talk about the economy, which is like businesses and money and investment and trade. And that is like dignity, for example, is very strongly linked to ideas like, wages, whether people are paid enough to have a good life, but also about prices, like, why is housing so unaffordable at the moment? How can we redesign that? And the same one, fairness, is a very direct one where it's like, it's very clearly about income and wealth and whether that is fairly distributed. Purpose is about, actually in Scotland, we start talking quite a bit more about business purpose at the moment. It's really the idea you shift from that idea that the only purpose of business is to make money for their shareholders in a short-term basis to one where businesses are like focused on serving multiple stakeholders and, being environmentally sustainable. And a lot of businesses are doing that already, but there's also some who are not. So they're all kind of, in some ways or another, linked to quite important ways how we organize the economy.
And that's the strength in them, isn't there, that you can kind of connect them to all those areas. I just wanted to comment that when I see your stuff, it's quite good not only to look at what's there, but what's not there. And I kind of like, a well-being economy is designed to serve people and planet, not the other way around. There's a P that a lot of people would think missing, which is profit. So it's good that that's not there in your definition. And I think when you're looking at those kind of 5 factors as well, you're not talking about a really kind of a real buzzword, which is efficiency. It's looking at the economy and not seeing the priority as efficiency. So I think it's really good to look at what's not there, as well as some of the really good stuff that you've got on there. We've just Karen, there you are. Okay, back to you, Karen. One other question from our audience, a quick one, Lucas. Do you know if the STUC have said anything about the wellbeing economy, if they're supportive or if they've done anything on that?
I don't think they've done a lot. We have some links with them, so I talk to them sometimes. They have, I think, they have a few comments. Like, we did a big open letter last year where we kind of set out a bit with the new government, set out like, this is what we want to see from a wellbeing economy. And the STUC signed that. So they have been supported on that front. I think they're a little bit cautious, probably rightly so, in that they're like, well, we don't want to support a concept that is just used in the end by the government to just do business as usual. Like, we want to see actual change.
I've just found this actually from Rose Fair. Yeah,
exactly. So, and we are totally behind them on that. I think we are really conscious that we have to make sure that, the promises of a wellbeing economy are linked to concrete actions to actually achieve them, which is not necessarily the case at the moment, I would say.
So that's going to take me to another point that's about the statutory definition of sustainable development. And, I liked your proposed definition, but with regards to primary prevention, so for example, the Scottish Government are very much on board with the idea of active travel, which is very interesting for me as a commuter cyclist. I think it's a really good thing, and we're trying to bring in more segregated cycle paths in Aberdeen, where I'm a councillor. So could you maybe give some other examples of what you're thinking about with primary prevention in this proposed definition?
Yeah, so primary prevention is generally one of the key ideas of a wellbeing economy. It's the idea that we try to address the root causes of problems rather than just sticking plasters on the end. And and that's kind of something that goes all the way through. And as I said, one of the examples is like you invest in active travel, and that has all kinds of effects down the line in terms of making people healthier, reducing air pollution, which then in the end it makes not only people healthier but also means it saves the NHS money. Other things, obviously, very obvious ones, is like mitigation in investments into mitigating climate change, because if we don't do that, that's going to have massive impacts further down the line, or already has in some places, in terms of but there's also a lot around, like, really interesting, and we've known for a very long time, like the economic determinants of health, like low wages, poverty, inequality, all lead to kind of bad health outcomes, which then again cost the government quite a lot of money. It makes people's life worse, but it also costs the government quite a lot of money to treat. So they're really all around you when you look for it.
Yeah, so for example, social prescribing, things like that would be, examples of primary prevention. The other thing that you brought up as well was you'd like to see the bill restore trust in democracy. And this is something I'm very conscious of as a councillor, because we have very low turnout for council elections in comparison to the Scottish Government elections. And really, the stuff that we do is very much more visceral and quick acting on people's lives than maybe the slow burn that a bill would bring to people's lives that's being formulated in the Scottish Parliament. And I'd really like to get some ideas, or what you're thinking about that, about improving democracy and participation in it.
Yeah, I think in terms of the bill specifically, the key one, as I said, is like that's more at the kind of Scottish Government level, is bringing in some how we determine the national outcomes, and especially kind of bringing in kind of more deliberative democratic approaches like citizens' assemblies to have a bit of a say in that. And there's like different ideas how you can do that. There's a really interesting example in it's in like East Belgium, like the German-speaking region of Belgium, where they have introduced like a permanent citizen council. So they have citizens assemblies like the ones we've had in Scotland on climate change and on like more general issues. But then they have another, like, which is small. It's also randomly selected citizens, but it's just a small number. I think it's less than 20. And their job is basically to organize the big citizens assemblies and decide what topics they run on, but also to hold the normal parliament to account, to actually do the things that the citizens assemblies have decided, which is something we've been really bad at in Scotland. If you look at the response from the climate change assembly to the response the Scottish government did to their recommendation, they were really not happy, because the Scottish government has basically said, well, we're not really going to do many of the things you told us to do, because we don't, can't be bothered.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is the issue when you're not a monetary sovereign. There's only so much that you can do what the people ask you to do. I think, citizens' assemblies are great, especially at teaching people more specialized knowledge as well, and especially they must be randomized. I have activists around me. They're organizing citizens' assemblies. They're not citizens. They're the people that turn up to every meeting. Who are, so really having them randomized is so important. But for example, I was at a meeting where a Sustrans, it was a Sustrans meeting. There was a lady there who she just discovered cycling, and she sort of just shared her joy with us. And later on in the meeting, she said, I'd like the councillors to step into my shoes. And I said, well, actually, I've been in those shoes for about 40 years. But you don't know that, do you? So people don't even know much about their elected representatives. I think there's also, I feel that people need to take an interest in who is representing them and should know things about them too. So I think that there is an onus as well on the people in the democracy to get interested. But I think citizens' assemblies are a good way to go. But they are expensive. You do have to pay for those people to turn up.
And the resources as well. There's a lot that goes into organising something like that. Well, that's a really interesting conversation so far on the democratic kind of response to the need in the wellbeing economy. And we've got another question from Gregor here, who asks, what's Lukas' opinion on degrowth eco-socialism? So you can talk about them separately or together or overall. Is it all overall as a concept?
So I'd probably say caveat that answer that I know quite a bit about degrowth. I'm not intimately familiar with exactly eco-socialism is. I've got a rough idea. I think certainly in terms of degrowth, for me, that's definitely part of the kind of wider wellbeing economy movement, and there's quite a bit of cross-inspiration and overlap between them. Like in some ways, the kind of core proposal of degrowth is the idea that we have to, in rich countries like here, we have to, downscale our production and consumption in an equitable way, to, get back to within planetary boundaries, and do that in a way that actually increases well-being. Like for me, that's pretty similar to what I said about the well-being economy earlier. And there's, as I said, quite a lot of cross-fertilization. Like one of the big voices on degrowth, like Federico De Maria and Jorgos Calles there in Barcelona, or Jason Hickel, they're also related and involved in WeAll activities. We have quite a conscious decision that we don't use the term degrowth, because as I said, WeAll is about building that broader movement, and degrowth, I think it's very important that it's there, and it opens up a lot of really interesting conversations, but it's not the term that brings a lot of a broad movement together, I think.
And it's not designed for that, is it, that term? It's deliberately provocative, the term degrowth. I think that having read a huge amount of literature around degrowth and the kind of less but growing literature around well-being, they're almost exactly the same thing. There's kind of like a very small, what's that kind of fag paper between both of them. And I think the wellbeing economy is a much more positive term to discuss a change in an economy than degrowth is. And that's, it's deliberately challenging. And what I want to do now, Lukas, thanks for that answer, is I want to show you a clip from our Festival of Economics. Kieran and I interviewed Gillian Martin, the Minister for Energy, Just Transition and Fair Work. And I asked her if this would all be solved with green or sustainable growth. So it's just a little 2 minutes. If you haven't been to the conference, no one have seen this yet either. So it's a little bit of an exclusive for you all. And then I'm going to ask you what your response to that would have been, Lukas.
Well, I'm more of a fan of the phrase sustainable growth. I think that I do actually. I mean, I think this is where I slightly disagree with the way that you've couched things. I think in order to get a fairer and more equal society where we eradicate poverty, there needs to be economic growth. But GDP is not the be-all and end-all. It is about that well-being economy. Again, I point to other countries who seem to have got this right, who've got this right in terms of the profits made by companies in their country been taxed in a way that isn't squandered on things like, well, I'll go back, I almost feel like I'm reading out the SNP playbook here, illegal wars, tax cuts for the richest, etc., etc. We've got a fairer, more equal society where people pay their taxes, where we stop this nonsense political debate about taxes as being something that the people should be cut. Taxes should be paid, but the people should see the benefit of those taxes in their public services in a way that they do in Denmark, where there is not a political debate about tax cuts. People accept that they have to pay a decent amount of tax in order to have the lifestyle that they enjoy.
My final point on that is that the countries who have what we would consider a well-being economy, let's look at the Nordics, are amongst the highest using resource and energy nations on the planet. There's no northern European country, there's no Western democracy which is operating within planetary boundaries. And this idea that we can still grow when we're using 8 times more than we should be growing, I think is a huge issue that we've got to challenge. And this. So Lukas, what did that what did you get from that then? What would have been your response to the comments from the minister there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very glad for your question there in the end, because that would have been my first point to that as well, is that I don't think it's like we haven't got a country that's already really done this, like that has managed to, reduce their environmental and carbon footprints to levels that are sustainable while also have, the kind of low levels of poverty and high quality of life that we want to see. And I think that's really the big issue I have with that idea of sustainable growth or green growth or inclusive growth, or, we've seen so many of them already. And the issue I have is that for me, a well-being economy is really about shifting priorities. Like, it's really okay, like, tackling the climate emergency, which we're still not doing enough about, and making sure everybody has enough to eat are the key priorities. And just tagging a different thing in front of growth is not going to do that. And as much as I agree with Gillian's points on taxes, that for me has got nothing to do with growth. You can tax better whether you're growing or not. Like, these are kind of two separate issues. And so I think my problem with that is that in the end, you always end up growing the wrong things, because we're never having the actual conversation about, because in reality, there will be some things we need to grow. We need more renewable energy. We need to insulate our houses better. We need more cycle lanes, but there's also things we need to shrink on that. And that's what politicians like to talk a lot less about, in terms of, we're kind of there with fossil fuels, but that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of, and I think, and I'm kind of working on the kind of, that's where, looking at the statistics and looking at the, at the history and the relationship between resource use and GDP growth and other things. It's like, my assumption is, if we do the things we have to do to tackle climate change, and we do the things we have to do to reverse biodiversity loss, and create a long-term sustainable environment, then we can do that in a way that actually makes people better off and make people have better lives, because we have more time, better air quality. It's actually quite a nice future, but I don't think it will have higher GDP. But as long as we're obsessed with GDP, we're not making the decisions we need to make to actually get to that better economy, because we're too scared about losing a few digits on the number that is GDP.
I think that conversation highlights, though, Lucas, how much work as a We All Alliance you've still got to do, because that minister, she was fairly new in post, but she was very confidently said, and you could see what her vision was, that we have to grow the economy, we have to tax more, and we have to be a little bit like the Nordics. So that was her end point, was where we were a country like the Nordics. That's what she thought was sustainable. And I think it was important to point out that that's way beyond the planetary boundaries. But that's how much work we've got to do. I do want to bring up this as well, because I think this is always really good. I like having an opportunity to bring this up. This is the global direct energy primary consumption. So how much energy we're using. And you can just see it just rises. It significantly takes off basically in the early 1970s. And this is world GDP. And you can see that it significantly takes off in the 1970s. And it's really clear, and you can see that really clearly, that there's a clear relationship between energy use and GDP. And I think we have to really focus on that and make it clear that when we're using more energy, we're increasing GDP. And when we're increasing GDP, we're using more energy. And we need to question how that aligns with our climate commitments in the short and the medium term. I think those two charts are really useful. Karen, if you've got maybe a final question for Lucas, I'll ask the audience if there's any more questions, and then please do drop them in.
I'd like to make a comment on what you've just said, both of you there as well. I think, the discussion about, in fact, William wrote a really good article for the National about degrowth. And I think it's a question of rebalancing. For example, not everyone is going to have an electric car. And that's fine for me. I'm quite happy to cycle and use public transport. And the increase in public transport, for example, is a way of, we have to be rebalancing our economy. And perhaps that's a more politically palatable way of talking about what actually needs to happen, maybe rather than redistribution, which we know kind of freaks out some people, as well as degrowth. A rebalancing, I think, is what we need to really sell to people, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the way you talk about and you frame it is kind of quite important. That's what we do a bit of work. But it's probably worth saying that while I said, I think overall everybody is going to have a better life in the wellbeing economy, I do think we also have to be quite clear that the current inequality in wealth and income that we see are not sustainable. They're actually probably the biggest barrier to doing some of the sustainable, the investments that we need and these kind of things, because at the moment, as the kind of thing, we can't, our transition to electric cars, where they make sense, they don't always, we should also invest in public transport and cycle lanes and stuff like that. But in some areas you need electric cars, but people can't afford them. And the low emission zone in Glasgow is a really bad example of how not to do it, because they just introduced it and it's great for air quality and stuff like that, but because it includes some areas of people can't afford a new car, then they're suddenly stuck with a terrible public transport system, which is Glasgow's bus system. So I think really you have to tackle the two together. You can't really do one or the other, especially also because, as well as point out, that relationship between energy use, carbon emissions holds also on an individual level. So people who have more money and spend more money are also the ones who produce a vast amount of carbon emissions. So it has to be kind of rebalanced in a fair way, I think.
This gets to the heart of the issue, and I'm going to pick up on something that Karen's mentioned a couple of times, and this is Scotland's inability to deficit spend to create money, to point it towards a part of the economy without taking it away from somewhere else. And I think the Scottish Government has set itself up, as it has in other economic transformations, but saying this is what we can do. So it's taken the responsibility, but it doesn't have any of the authority. Now, for a wellbeing economy to work, take Glasgow's low emission zone, for example. You introduce that 3 years after you've nationalised the buses, you've spent £1 billion on active transport in the city, and then you introduce that type of zone, and maybe even you give everyone who's got an old car £250 so they're able to invest in a new car or spend that in active transport. But none of that happens because Scotland doesn't have the ability to create the currency, to spend it, to invest, and that just handicaps all of the areas that we're hoping to see. So I think almost in a sense that trying the wellbeing economy and failing, you could argue, is worse than actually not trying a wellbeing economy at all. Now, I don't suggest we shouldn't do that, but can you see those significant concerns that people have? Because once it's failed, it becomes much harder for people to get on board to support these type of progressive ideas that we want.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I definitely see the risks in the sense that, it is, with what the Scottish Government, I think they could do more than what they have at the moment. There's issues, for example, where they have powers, like in terms of land reform, which is, we didn't get on to talk about, unfortunately. Very interesting topic as well.
Let's finish on that then, because I think that is really, really important. Kate, have you got another question, or will we go straight to the land issue for?
No, I've got another question, but it doesn't matter. Go to the land reform. In fact, did you see that Commonweal's actually just written a paper on that? That's come out today.
Yeah. So, Lukas, what role does land play in a wellbeing economy? How important is it, and how and where does it fit in, do you think, to the Scottish Government's overarching idea of a wellbeing economy? Two difficult questions for you there, for sure.
Yeah, with a short time to answer them. It's probably worth saying can talk about that, but there's excellent papers by Commonweal. There's also an excellent paper by Laurie McFarlane at Future Economy Scotland, which they just published. So if you want to delve into that more deeply, check those out. They're really good. But basically land is, I think we've been doing a bit of work on it because it's absolutely really important for a wellbeing economy, because it is, it's really literally needed for every part of our well-being. We need space to build our houses, we need space to have our businesses, we need space for nature, we need space for our cycle lanes, we need space, for whatever we want to do, we need somewhere to do it. And it really underpins, quite literally, all parts of our well-being. But it's also very important in a conventional economic sense. It also underpins all conventional economic activities in the very same way. So it's a very fundamental kind of economic thing, land, but it comes with some very specific properties, in which the main thing is that they don't make it anymore. It's fixed. Unless you start filling in the sea around Scotland, there's very little you can do to actually expand the amount of land that we have. And that means that, whenever we have, growth in population, growth in other things, the value of land tends to go up. And then that increase in value goes to the people who own the land, even though they haven't done anything to actually, invest in the land or something to increase that value. And so it's kind of quite a specific thing. And that means usually in other countries, it's quite strongly regulated what you can do with land, who's allowed to own it, who gets that kind of increase in value. And in Scotland, we're not doing that. Like, we have a very, very concentrated land ownership, and also very, very lowly regulated land market. And that means that, we're not using our land for the things that would actually make the biggest difference for a wellbeing economy, because we're using them for things that make the most money to a small number of investors. And that is actually something where the Scottish Government could do something, because they would have powers to potentially do something like a land value tax, or put on limitations on subsidies, or put on things, like other countries have rules that you have to be tax resident in the country if you want to own land there. So it's kind of like, it's so important, but at the moment, because the ownership is so concentrated, it's basically a very small group of people who decide what the land in Scotland is used for. And in many cases, that's not aligned with what we would like it to be used in a wellbeing economy. And that is directly impacts people's lives in terms of, if you're wondering why houses are so expensive and unaffordable, a good part of that is because the land they stand on is actually very expensive, not necessarily the house itself. Or if, as you say, we need to restore our biodiversity and these kind of things. At the moment, that's very hard to do because we haven't got the land necessarily where to do it. So yeah, it's kind of, or if you want to start a business, especially in a rural place like here, I live in a little village in the Highlands called Kinderleven. It's very hard to find space to do it in many cases. So it's really kind of quite a fundamental issue that I think is kind of captures a lot of the elements we're talking about the economy. There's the fairness aspect in the sense that, it's very unequally distributed. There's the purpose aspect of what are we using our land for. There's the democratic aspect. It's like, who decides what the land is being used for? It's not decided very democratically at the moment. There's a dignity aspect in that it's very important for a lot of, the basic needs that we have, housing, food, that all depends very strongly on land. So yeah, it's kind of a very interesting issue, I think.
Fantastic. Yeah, I would agree with all of that. I think it is an area which the Scottish Government should play a much more active part in. And one thing that Scotland has in abundance is land. We're a huge country for the amount of people who are here. It's just in the wrong hands and it's being used for the wrong purpose. And I think a really important thing for us to consider is Scotland's food sovereignty and how little of our arable land is used for food production compared to other parts of the UK. And it puts us in a position of always having to import food into Scotland. So there's a huge economic issue around land and how that plays into the wellbeing economy. Lukas, thanks so much for joining us. We've got a couple of minutes left. Is there anything you want to say or finish on before we let you head off for this evening?
No, I think thank you very much for having me. As I said, We All is an alliance. It's free, so check out our website if you want to find out more. We also, as I said, we had a bit of a discussion about the Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill, which is kind of one of the priorities for us this year. And I think that could really be a step change in the long term for Scotland. So please, get involved with that, find out more about it, talk to your MP about it, talk to your councillors about it, make sure that actually happens, because the Scottish Government hasn't quite really actually promised they're going to do it at the moment.
They're thinking about it. Well, Lukas, thank you so much. We've got a little, just a 2.5 minute video. We actually, as part again of our Festival Economics, I interviewed Clara Matty from the USA, and I asked about the wellbeing economy, and also Erin, who's based in Australia. I've just got a couple of short clips as they talk about wellbeing and also degrowth for us to play us out. Lukas, thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at the Festival of Economics next year, or maybe some of our other events. And I'll send you that link so you can see the interview with the Future Generations Commissioner. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you found that engaging and interesting, and please do join us next week. We're going to have a couple of episodes next week. We're going to speak about green ports on Monday, and then we're going to speak with Richard Murphy about his new taxing wealth report. So a busy week next week. Lukas, thanks so much, and see you soon.
Bye.
So I'll play this little video now, and hopefully I'll see you all next week. Kieran, bye.
Bye.
I think the concept of a wellbeing economy is inherently anti-capitalist. Would you agree?
I would agree. Yes. And that's why we have to denounce when it's instrumentalized by the few who still benefit from our system to give us the illusion that actually humane capitalism and environmentally friendly capitalism is a viable solution for future generations. This is a lie. It needs to be exposed. And we need to say capitalism is in contradiction with the well-being of the majority, and the majority should count, not the 0.1% who of course benefits from the system, and we'll try to do whatever it takes to maintain it alive, including lying about how well-being is possible under capitalism.
I think that we're at the stage where, so there's this quote that I really like, and I'll probably butcher it as I try and say it, but I think people get that something's wrong, like broadly at a societal level, and that when they get that other people also get that something's wrong, then we'll start to see traction, like this idea. So we sort of know things aren't quite right, but everyone's still pretending that it's normal to just go about everyday business and just do what we're doing. You know, last year, we'll keep doing it this year. Nothing dramatic is going to change. The government still has targets that are too low. They're not in line with the science. They're still making decisions like opening coal mines and gas fields and things like this that don't align with what their targets are, but there's not enough people pushing back against it. So I feel like the next step is to just really click that societal tipping point, I guess, and to really ram home with this government that they're not going to stay in power unless they start to do what's needed to avoid a mass extinction event. So yeah, I feel like the work is at the grassroots level, really. That needs to be done.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of our main roles is to show people that there is an alternative. And I think that's one of the issues at the moment, is people just don't see what the alternative is. But yeah, they clearly see that something's wrong, but they're not sure that there is an alternative. And hopefully these concepts of degrowth, community wealth building, and a wellbeing economy help people get there.